A full-term neonate presents on 14th day with 18 grams of milligrams of unconjugated bilirubin. So what is the common etiology? If you examine once more the past 5 years of question papers, you are very sure. Breast milk jaundice, breastfed jaundice, neonatal hepatitis, neonatal cholestasis, and the prolonged physiological jaundice. They are the 6 important entities. You must be doubly sure. How do they present, what day they will appear, what day they will disappear, is it unconjugated or conjugated? Invariably questions come on the neonatal jaundice. Even in clinical practice, what is the very important case you come across in the pediatrics posting in housemanship? Once more, neonatal jaundice. So that's the reason in pediatrics posting at least you must be doubly sure to discuss this every day in the ward rounds. So direct hyperbilirubinemia is a feature of the congenital biliary atresia. Otherwise all the other causes mentioned are capable of causing unconjugated bilirubin. So that is the reason, doctor, you have neonatal cholangiopathy where there is a cholestasis and there is a development of a direct hyperbilirubinemia, not indirect unconjugated hyperbilirubinemia. So that is the reason D becomes the answer. Otherwise hypothyroidism, G6PD deficiency, breast milk jaundice, they are all the ones which are responsible for the unconjugated hyperbilirubinemia. Very much is what I want to underscore to all of you. Now 1 2 comments about the breast milk jaundice which we quite often discuss in our Sunday test. It is the neonatal jaundice associated with the breastfeeding. Within the first 4 to 7 days is the one it will appear, and unlike the physiological jaundice it will prolong longer than that of the physiological jaundice, by which you will recognize. And generally it is the main reason is one of the substances, hormonal substance in the breast milk which is responsible for the breast milk jaundice is what you need to basically remember. There is another type called breastfeeding jaundice. If the breast milk is insufficient in production, that lead to development of the breastfeeding jaundice is what need to be remembered. From where is the bile acid synthesized? Fundamental question. Acetyl-CoA become HMG-CoA become mevalonate and finally becomes the cholesterol. Cholesterol in turn become converted into the bile salts, as all of you know very well. In this process, what is the rate limiting enzyme in the bile salt biosynthesis, doctor? It is the 7-alpha hydroxylase which is the rate limiting step in the conversion of cholesterol towards the bile acids is what you need to basically remember. This is a very interesting question. Where is the renin secreted? Few questions will what you call shake our fundamental, I mean under the feet kind of questions these are. So you must be very sure to not get the Magnan's tactile hallucinations in the exam hall while answering some questions. You must be confident enough. You have a wonderful juxtaglomerular apparatus which is the source of the renin. Now what is it constituted of? Why is it called juxtaglomerular? It is closer to glomerulus. Typically it has got the ascending limb of the distal tubule, the cells of it which constitute the macula densa is a part of this juxtaglomerular apparatus, which is the source of the renin, is what need to be remembered. But what is renin? Renin is otherwise called angiotensinogenase. Angiotensin is generated from angiotensinogen. Angiotensinogen is bound to angiotensinogenase. So that is the reason, doctor, renin is otherwise the grandfather and the grandson is angiotensin is what you need to basically remember. So basically angiotensinogenase, it is a circulating enzyme which will be basically produced by the juxtaglomerular apparatus of the kidney. When will it is produced? Whenever there is a low blood volume or if there is any low serum sodium concentration, you want to retain water and sodium, you require basically the renin's help. And what is very important for the production of the renin? Who will tell the juxtaglomerular cells that, sir, the blood volume is low, we require to retain water and sodium, please produce renin? Who will tell that? It is the prostaglandins which mediate the release of the renin by the juxtaglomerular cells is what you need to basically remember. Similarly, sympathetic activation also can make the renin to become released. How? There are beta 1 receptors and alpha 1 receptors on the juxtaglomerular cells. Whenever sympathetic system is activated, when will sympathetic system is activated, doctor? When we are hypovolemic, when our blood volume is very low, that is the time where we want to retain the water and the sodium, that will cause the sympathetic activation. Sympathetic activation in turn in a hypovolemic state will cause the stimulation of the juxtaglomerular apparatus to cause the release of the renin is what I want to once more underscore to all of you. In turn renin will cleave the angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1. Now another common question asked in the exam, where is the angiotensinogen produced? Renin is produced in the juxtaglomerular cells, but angiotensinogen is produced basically in the liver, is what you need to basically remember. And basically this conversion of angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1 is mediated by the renin, and typically it happens inside the plasma in the vascular endothelium, is what I want to underscore. And then another enzyme produced by the endothelium called angiotensin converting enzyme in turn will convert the angiotensin 1 into 2, and angiotensin 2 will finally act on the vascular epithelium and will cause all the important things required in a hypovolemic state. Once more, another question had been asked on the same topic. So examiner is obsessed about molecular level of kidney, that is first year physiology subject. Juxtaglomerular apparatus is formed by which part of nephron? So these are the questions which are like after coming out we say, oh, silly answer we kept. We were more sillier than the question itself. So that was the main reason, doctor, you need to be doubly sure to not, because ascending and descending distal tubule will be struggling in the exam as if somebody strangulated us if you are not very sure where it is. So basically, doctor, you have one distal tubule, it has got one ascending limb, and that is the place where your juxtaglomerular apparatus is located, is what need to be remembered. So that's the reason, doctor, the juxtaglomerular apparatus basically has got three important components. It has got the macula densa, it has got the extraglomerular mesangial cells, and it has got the juxtaglomerular cells, three important components. And out of this, juxtaglomerular cells produce the renin, as already we have discussed. Now there is another important question. How is this renin release is mediated? Who is the secondary messenger which is involved? We need to remember, doctor, once there is a low blood pressure, low perfusion to the juxtaglomerular cells, they become swollen, and this swelling will increase the cyclic AMP levels inside them, and that in turn will stimulate the pKa, and that in turn will cause the secretion of the renin. That's the reason, doctor, it is the cyclic AMP which is mediating the release of the renin from the juxtaglomerular apparatus, is what I want to once more underscore. It is the descending limb of the distal ascending limb of the distal convoluted tubule which is the important component. Now let us talk about some of the important cancer drugs. Lot of questions come on this. Methotrexate, all of you know very well. It is not irreversible, it is the reversible inhibition. Another common question asked in the exam, methotrexate is reversible or irreversible? It is reversible. Competitive inhibitor of the dihydrofolate reductase is what need to be remembered, and we require the dihydrofolate reductase because it converts the dihydrofolate into the tetrahydrofolate, is what I want to underscore. Now what happens if dihydrofolate is not converted to tetrahydrofolate? Why will it cause the DNA synthesis to become affected? The main reason is, unless the dihydrofolate is converted to tetrahydrofolate, it can't help the thymidinate synthase to convert the UMP into TMP, which is required for the DNA synthesis. So that is the reason, doctor, tetrahydrofolate is important, and for the formation of the tetrahydrofolate you require the dihydrofolate reductase, is what I want to once more underscore to all of you. In which phase of the cell synthesis, cell cycle, does this antimetabolites basically act at? It is at the level of the S phase. Another common question in the exam. Interstitial nephritis is caused by many drugs. It is also a standard question, no surprise about it. So antibiotics like penicillins, cephalosporins, sulfur drugs and quinolones, and the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs and diuretics like thiazides and furosemide, allopurinol, phenytoin, and which antitubercular drug? It is the rifampicin, not the INH. That is what exactly is tested by the examiner, is the one which is responsible for the interstitial nephritis. Even interferon alpha also is capable of causing, is what need to be remembered. So how will the solving MCQs help you to prepare for entrance? Very simple. Like at least in the last moment before exam you need not remember everything. At least you need to remember which ATT drug is the one which is implicated, is a common question. So that's how you need to maximize your energy, is what need to be remembered. Now let us go to the next question. If there is a hemolysis, especially an intravascular hemolysis, what will happen? There is a hemoglobinuria, there is a decreased haptoglobin levels, and also there is a development of reticulocytosis briskly in hemolysis. But where do you come across this Burr cells and teardrop cells, is my question to all of you. It is not with the hemolysis. Where will you come across Burr cell? Burr cell basically is an erythrocyte which has got multiple small projections which are projecting out of it. Horns are there on it. And basically it need to be differentiated from a very closely looking cell called spur cell. Spur cell, otherwise called acanthocyte, is the closest differential diagnosis for the Burr cell in the peripheral smear is what need to be remembered. So basically Burr cells appear for two important reasons. Any systemic conditions can cause it. Even as an artifact, while preparing the peripheral smear also, it can lead to Burr cell appearance, because as an artifact you must be doubly sure. So both systemic conditions cause Burr cell formation. Uremia is very common cause. Similarly lymphosarcoma, another common question this is. Lymphosarcoma is one of the main causes for the Burr cell appearance. Even practically also, Burr cells are found means you must look for it. Similarly peptic ulcers, bile acid abnormalities also can cause. So this is a classical azotemia patient who has got the Burr cells in his peripheral smear where there are a lot of spikes which are projecting out of the RBCs is what need to be basically remembered. Then comes the teardrop cells. Where do they form? Whenever there is a myelothesic anemia where the bone marrow is totally jeopardized and bankrupt, extra medullary hematopoiesis in the spleen and liver if it is happening, unlike the bone marrow which can be able to decorate the RBC in a biconcave disc, the spleen cannot do that. So whenever extramedullary hematopoiesis is happening in the spleen, instead of biconcave disc appearance, the RBCs will have a teardrop like appearance is what need to be remembered. So there is a reason, doctor, the presence of the teardrop cells is a feature of the myelothesic process is what you need to basically remember, myelofibrosis, etc., etc. Now let's go to the next question. Are there any drugs which are capable of causing hypertension? So hardly in one single page, drug induced complications, probably in a couple of pages in Harrison's Internal Medicine. Invariably 1-2 questions come on that list. For example, interstitial nephritis, which drugs are causing it? Similarly, which are the emetogenic drugs? And similarly, hypertension causing drugs, etc., etc. So 2 pages, drug adverse effects is, I think, first or second volume is the one which is frequently the highly hit area in the Harrison. Now let us talk about drug induced hypertension. NSAIDs can cause, estrogen containing OCPs also can cause hypertension. Corticosteroids, cyclosporin A, erythropoietin, very common. Do you need to give erythropoietin for a long time in any subset of patients, doctor? Renal failure patients. You need to give erythropoietin injection, which is very costly also. So erythropoietin. Similarly, monoamine oxidase inhibitors with tyramine containing food and sympathomimetic drugs like ephedrine are all capable of causing drug-induced hypertension is what need to be remembered. Now let us talk about the rickets in infancy. Very simple question. Can infant can walk? He can't. Unless he ambulates, bow legs will not appear. So that is as simple as that. So now the question is, craniotapes or rachitic rosary or a wide open fontanelle, they are all the features of rickets in infancy. Only when a rickettsial patient is about 2 years and he is an ambulatory patient, then the bow legs become the problem is what you have to fundamentally understand. So the craniotape is one of the manifestations of the very early manifestation in the infants, and the bow legs in an ambulatory child is what need to be remembered. And what is Marfan sign in the case of the rickets? One new question for every old question. We need to remember there is a double epiphysis like impression if you happen to palpate the tibial malleolus in a rickettsial child, which is basically called the Marfan sign is what need to be fundamentally remembered. Now what is standard error? Fundamental question in statistics. Standard deviation of a sampling distribution of the mean value is indicated by the standard error. It is given by the formula standard deviation by square root of n. N is the total number of observations that we have done, and we have one standard deviation divided by square root of n will give you the standard error of that particular standard deviation. Now in our case, what is the, okay, it is not given here. Let's go to the next, this is the next question. Immediately another question on standard error. 100 people are there, so n value is 100, square root of 100 is 10. And you are having 1 which is the standard error, standard deviation value. So 1 by 10 is 0.1 is the standard error here is what need to be remembered. 3-year-old child has pallor petechial rash thrombocytopenia and there is splenomegaly, spleen is not palpable, then what is the most probable diagnosis? All of you know very well. Presence of any organomegaly like hepatosplenomegaly or the presence of lymphadenopathy is against the diagnosis of the aplastic anemia is what need to be remembered. Now cow, buffalo, human milk, invariably one or the other question will come, and it is the thing which no intelligence is required, more of mugging is required. So we need to know, doctor, at least milk has got two proteins. What are they? One is called casein, other is called whey protein. Out of this, it is the casein which constitutes 75% of the cow's milk is what need to be remembered. That's the reason it contains more whey protein than casein is a wrong statement is what need to be remembered. Everything that follows is the history. Basically cow, if you look at the lactose, it has got only 4.4, but human has got 7.4. Obviously mother's milk is the sweetest milk ever possible in the world. So lactose is more abundant than that of the cow is what need to be remembered. How about the protein? Cow is more robust because her protein is meant for the junior cow, which is expected to work more than a little infant going to the school. Nowadays infants also have got too many bags to carry, so probably the milk which is low in, human milk low in protein may be inadequate for our guys, so they may get a kyphoscoliosis as a complication of going to public schools. So that's very important. A child presented with a fever, non-productive cough with dyspnea had been initiated on an antibiotic therapy. After within few days that became a productive cough. Really it is a very unfortunate situation in clinical practice. Patient without any sputum comes, you start antibiotic, he develops sputum. So you become degraded, patient will also be bothered. Sir, I never had sputum, because of your antibiotic only I got the sputum. So let us look at this scenario. X-ray shows presence of hyperlucency, but the pulmonary function test shows obstructive changes. Classically, doctor, on telephone only you can diagnose. Non-productive cough after antibiotic initiated, after a few days become productive with a hyperinflated lungs. Closing the eyes only you can say BOOP is your diagnosis. What is that? Bronchiolitis obliterans with organizing pneumonia, it is called as, is your diagnosis. But there is a small exception here. How will be the pulmonary function test in a case of BOOP? Will it be obstructive or restrictive type? It is basically a restrictive pattern, not obstructive pattern. There is the only thing which is against the possibility of the bronchiolitis obliterans as a possibility, because there you expect restrictive rather than obstructive changes, but I am not very sure what is there in the examiner's mind. But anyway, all the remaining three, post-viral syndrome, alveolar microlithosis or follicular bronchitis of the viral origin, none of them can explain this non-productive cough becoming the productive cough. So that is the reason, still out of benefit of doubt, I consider bronchiolitis obliterans with organizing pneumonia as a possible diagnosis in this case, but for the exception of the obstructive pattern that the patient is having. So now let us go to the next question. Where do you come across maximum triglyceride levels? You need to be doubly sure, doctor. So what is our common sense rule for preparation for entrance? Invariably one question comes on the hyperlipoproteinemias, you must be encyclopedic about different types. So basically, doctor, chylomicrons have predominant component of triglycerides, whereas if you look at the cholesterol component, typically it is the VLDL which is the one which has got the predominant content of the cholesterol is what you are able to, the LDL is the one which is having predominant amount of cholesterol is what you are able to basically recognize. Now imatinib mesylate is one of the wonder drug that had been that has come up in the modern era. It belongs to one important group of drugs called inhibitors of tyrosine kinase enzyme group of drugs, imatinib mesylate. Now what is the main advantage of this imatinib mesylate basically? Where do we use, doctor? Which leukemia? Chronic myeloid leukemia. Earlier days we used to use all the other busulfan, etc., etc. Now it is all the era of imatinib mesylate. Now let us talk about it. In our body we have a lot of areas where tyrosine kinase activity is required. Common thing is insulin receptor. It also belongs to the group called tyrosine kinase group. Similarly, the Abelson proto-oncogene which is seen in the CML and the platelet derived growth factor receptor also belongs to this group called the tyrosine kinase group is what need to be remembered. Now what happens in chronic myelogenous leukemia? Basically here there is a Philadelphia chromosome which is the fusion protein formed between the ABL with BCR is what need to be remembered, and the function of the imatinib is it will decrease this BCL ABL activity. Why? Because this fusion protein BCR ABL behaves like a tyrosine kinase, and imatinib is capable of inhibiting the tyrosine kinase, hence it inhibits this BCR-ABL activity, hence it is useful in the case of the CML is what you need to basically remember. So now let us look at how the imatinib basically functions. You have a tyrosine kinase which has got a enzymatic activity and it is important. Now the question is, even insulin receptor also is tyrosine kinase. Is the imatinib selective or it will destroy insulin receptor also? It does not destroy the insulin receptor, it is very selective. Now you want to expose the subclavian artery, then which is the vessel, which is the muscle which you need not cut? This is a very interesting question. Subclavian artery is there, vein is there. They have got different relationship with the muscles in the anterior part of the neck. Let us look at this part very carefully. The moment subclavian artery originates, it travels laterally between two muscles, anterior scalene and the middle scalene. Out of this, the scalenus anterior is anterior to it and middle scalene is posterior to it. So if you want to expose subclavian artery, do you need to cut the posterior muscle or anterior muscle? Only anterior muscle, which is the scalenus anterior. You don't need to cut the scalenus medius. That's what the examiner is closely asking you. But there is a difference to subclavian vein. Subclavian vein travels anterior to the subclavian, scalenus anterior itself is what need to be basically remembered. So if you take the scalenus anterior to that is the vein, posterior to that is the artery. And if you take the artery, anterior to that is scalenus anterior, posterior to that is scalenus, scalenus medius is what need to be basically remembered. But it's very difficult to remember these small facts. I don't know how people top the entrances. So really let us see how many of our people will become. Some of you may be topping in a couple of days, the result will come. But very finest aspects, no regrets if you do wrong in such questions. But definitely regrets are there if you don't answer imatinib mesylate, which is a common question expected to be answered. In right thoracic outlet syndrome, typically what is not seen as a complication. Now this is another little confusing question where we don't get any literature support in the regular textbooks. We need to remember, doctor, there is a brachial plexopathy which can follow as a complication of the thoracic outlet syndrome. There can be involvement of the long thoracic nerve leading to the development of the scapular winging. So long thoracic nerve is very much involved. Then another important thing is the lymphatic chylus fistula as a complication of the thoracic outlet syndrome surgery. Now examiner gave a clue that it is the right-sided thoracic outlet syndrome. Is the right word is there? Good. Now if you look at the chylus, that is the thoracic duct part, is it there on the left side or is it more on the right side? Generally, if you take the two sides of thoracic duct, the left-sided thoracic duct is more vulnerable to the injury if you happen to operate on the thoracic outlet rather than the right side. So that is the reason chylus fistula is more often a complication of the left-sided thoracic outlet syndrome surgery rather than right thoracic outlet syndrome, is at least what I am able to justify with all the possible ignorance. So that's the reason you need to counter check what is there in the examiner's mind. Bone marrow aplasia typically is not seen there. So what are all the drug induced causes of aplastic anemia? Once more, our Harrison's middle page, drug induced conditions has come back. So important is that page. Benzene, radiation, certain drugs like chloramphenicol, phenytoin, quinine and chloropromazine and phenylbutazone are all capable of causing aplastic anemia, especially chloramphenicol. It can cause in a dose dependent manner or even a idiosyncratic reaction also. Anyway, it can cause the bone marrow aplasia is what need to be remembered. So as a reason, methicillin is not the one out of these drugs which is implicated is what need to be remembered. A pregnant female diagnosed to have thyrotoxicosis is receiving, instead of propylthiouracil, she is receiving the carbimazole. There is an entity called carbimazole teratogenesis syndrome. Now what are the features of this important carbimazole syndrome? Choanal atresia is a recurrent feature of the fetal carbimazole syndrome is what need to be remembered. Carbimazole can cross the placenta and also can lead to the fetal goiter is what need to be remembered. Another important problem is the baby born will have scalp defects. Typically, once the mother is receiving carbimazole, so there is a reason, doctor, except cleft lip, all the other three, choanal atresia, scalp defects and fetal goiter, all the three are possible complications of the carbimazole therapy is what need to be remembered. Now let us quickly look at the classification of the antiemetics. Antiemetics can be 5-HT3 receptor antagonists like the ondansetron. They can even be the dopamine antagonists like the domperidone, droperidol, haloperidol and chloropromazine. They can be antihistamines like the cyclizine. Even the steroids can be antiemetic like the dexamethasone, and propofol is the one which is given intravenously. Also for the purpose of anti-emesis is what need to be remembered. Even benzodiazepines like midazolam is an example of an antiemetic. So there is a reason out of all this, doctor, domperidone, ondansetron, cyclizine definitely are the anti-emetic drugs is what need to be basically remembered. Now reticulocytosis is not seen in which important anemic state? Tell me, doctor. You have gone through the complete blood picture of a patient who has got anemia. The reti count of the patient is 8% or 9%. That means a brisk reticulocytosis is there. If it is there, generally what do you contemplate? Which type of anemia? Brisk reticulocytosis will be there. You will be having it in hemolytic anemia. Common rule of thumb. If it is not there, it is not really that brisk. It is 2% or 3% means nutritional anemia. In spite of a severe anemia, there is no reticulocytosis at all. Means you should think of aplastic anemia. That is a basic rule. But aplastic anemia is not given in this. There is an entity called dyserythropoietic syndrome. What is the other name given for it called as? Blackfan-Diamond syndrome is what need to be remembered, which is a congenital erythroid precursor aplasia. If the erythroid precursors itself are aplastic, where is the reticulocyte produced? It is not produced. So it is the anemia typically with decreased erythroid progenitors with the characteristic absence of reticulocytosis in a case of anemia. Facial malformations and palate, and they also have a risk of developing individuals is what need to be remembered. What is the advantage of dobutamine, doctor? Basically compared to that of adrenaline or any other thing. Commonly in our clinical practice for a shock patient we give dobutamine. Dobutamine we give because it will increase the renal perfusion. Why do we give dobutamine? It gives cardiotonic support. So it is a beta-1 adrenergic agonist. This is one concept you must be doubly sure, doctor, which are alpha-1 antagonist agonists, beta-1, beta-2, beta-3 agonist antagonists. Today only you must revise, otherwise they stand out to be the silliest mistakes we can ever perform in any entrance exam. So it is a direct acting agent and it increases the cardiac contractility because of its specificity for the beta-1 action is what need to be remembered. And because it does not act on the dopamine receptors, it does not lead to norepinephrine release, it is less prone to induce the hypertension unlike the other catecholamines. It won't cause vasoconstriction is what need to be basically remembered. Now what is the most rapid method to detect the karyotype in a case of intersex? Basically there is a technique called fluorescent in situ hybridization, which is cytogenetic technique, which will be able to identify, localize the presence of or absence of a specific DNA sequence, which is important to differentiate X and Y chromosome. So it is a very rapid way if you are having a patient of intersex to know whether he is having XX or XY or XO or XXY is what you need to basically remember. Now to perform a polymerase chain reaction, magnify a small segment of DNA into a big segment, what are the important things required for performing that important function? Basically, doctor, a single gene or a part of gene or a non-coding sequence, any of that can be magnified and amplified by this technique called PCR. Now what are the components of the PCR? You require one Hall ticket, that is the DNA template is required. One or more primers which are complementary to the DNA must be there. There must be a DNA polymerase, the pen and ink must be there, Taq polymerase it is otherwise called. You also require DNTP, small chits to pass the MBBS exam. And in addition to that, what else is required, doctor? You require a buffer solution. Give a chocolate to your examiner and invigilator suddenly if she happens to identify that you are copying. So you need to have some buffer solution. And divalent cations, magnesium, manganese, etc. And monovalent cations like potassium ions, they are all the things required in that kit called PCR kit is what need to be basically remembered. I think AIIMS has a wonderful cytogenetics department, one of the country's most premium. So that's the reason they expect that all of us passing out of any medical colleges know what are the components of a PCR kit. So let's go to the next question. If you use a hypertensive, one of it can lead to the development of impotence. In the 1980s, if you are detected hypertension, it is almost as sad as news that you got HIV positivity. Because in those days, beta blockers are like propranolol like beta blockers, not Inderol is a very common prescription those days. So propranolol if you give, patient's BP comes down, but he will say that बात उस जमाने के नहीं हो रहा है साहब, ये क्या दवा दिए आप? So is what he'll be crying before you. But is it the same in the modern era? No. Atenolol is more specific. It hits the vasculature, nothing else. So that is the reason, doctor. Beta blockers are notorious to lead to the development of impotence is what you need to basically remember. If there is a idiopathic hemochromatosis, what is the first thing that will appear? This first earliest, these are the sad stories of the whole preparation for entrance, because when you join the post graduation, you don't come across a patient who is first or the best. You get the last and the latest. So that is the reason you must you need to remember a few things. I will make you the master of this. Generally hemochromatosis, iron overload is the problem in a 30 to 50-year-old patient. They can have liver disease, skin pigmentation, diabetes, arthropathy. Out of all the symptoms, the earliest symptom that the patient will suffer is fatigue, is what need to be remembered, which itself is an isolated MCQ which can make us to strangulate in the exam hall. Later the patients will have hyperpigmentation, diabetes, cirrhosis, they are all the very late stories, final year MBBS stories. Then we have most of the patients who are otherwise asymptomatic, they absolutely have no problem at all. How are they diagnosed? Suddenly their serum iron levels are tested, or complete blood picture was done by one of the best hematologists in the country, and they found that, oh, your serum iron levels are high, possibly you have hemochromatosis. So that is the reason, doctor, in a totally asymptomatic patient, a rise of the serum iron is one of the earliest manifestations of the hemochromatosis. So that means all of us after crossing 30, do we need to have serum iron tested? Not really required. But I still remember one of our postgraduates, just because hospital is doing free, got serum iron done. It is unexpectedly very high. So from there the whole story began. Then he sent for a genotype, whether hemochromatosis gene is abnormal, etc., karyotyping and other things. That's the reason over investigation is always not required. We are treating patients, not the papers. So that's important. So serum iron, which is elevated, especially postprandial rise, is the earliest feature of the hemochromatosis, is what I want to underscore to all of you. Now, which poisons are dialysable and which are not? Methanol, ethylene glycol, chloride hydrate, lithium, arsenic, acetaminophen, bromide, salicylates, fluoride, digitalis, metaquone, etc., etc. If you remember the big list, you are good. They are all hemodialysable. At least barbiturates you remember, that's commonly asked question in the exam. Lithium is another common drug. Salicylates you need to remember, which is commonly seen in the clinical practice. Digitalis is another important drug. All the remaining things is blah blah. I have never done for any alcoholic for ethylene glycol sake, ethylene glycol is antifreeze, right? So at least for the sake of methanol or something, I have never seen dialysis being done. So 20-year-old presents with 9 months history of neck swelling, thyrotoxic features, and investigation shows T4 elevated and the presence of 2 centimeter nodule. Then what is the next investigation? Very interesting question. How do you evaluate a thyroid nodule? Right from the days of final year surgery, this used to be a very important exam case. That's the reason we need to be doubly sure. Whenever there is a solitary thyroid nodule, the first test is TSH test. If TSH is low, they are hyperthyroid. If TSH is normal, then they are more likely to be euthyroid. If they are thyrotoxic with a low TSH value, then next investigation you need to do is the scan, radio scan. By that they become hot nodule or cold nodule. If it is a hot nodule, there is no doubt you can go ahead with surgery or radioiodine. If it is cold nodule, the problem is it can be benign or it can be malignant also, is a possibility. Now if it is a cold nodule, then you need to initiate FNAC. Then if it proves to be malignant, then you need to do partial or total thyroidectomy. Suppose if it is suspicious, then you take a frozen section, and if that proves to be malignant histology wise, frozen section gives a bigger bit than the FNAC, right? So you need to take a small frozen section and then test it. If it is malignant, then you do the surgery. Suppose if it is benign or indeterminate, only lobectomy is sufficient. Then if it is benign itself, then what you want to do? Try to repeat the same FNAC after 6 months, which is a more sad news for the patient, because his diagnosis is not yet finalized and he need to once more come for this painful procedure 6 months later. Then comes the, suppose if FNAC is insufficient, then what to do? Do an ultrasound, check whether it is cystic or solid. If it is cystic, then it will regress, you need to observe it. Suppose if it is recurrent and if you are having a high clinical suspicion, you can't wait the suspense anymore, do lobectomy is the management of choice. Suppose if it is solid, then repeat the FNAC, clinically suspected that it is very high chances, then you need to do the thyroid lobectomy. Just you need to, 3-4 patients you need to follow this same protocol, automatically you will remember what to do next. Commonly questions come on this important algorithm only when it comes to the solitary thyroid nodule. Then a solitary thyroid nodule patient, if you have done TSH test, what are the possibilities? Suppose if TSH is high with a solitary thyroid nodule, high TSH means low T3 T4, means hypothyroid state. So which condition can present with a hypothyroid state with a solitary thyroid nodule? Hashimoto's thyroiditis need to be suspected. Suppose if TSH is low means it is a hyperthyroid state with a solitary thyroid nodule. When is it possible? If it is a multinodular goiter or if it is an autonomous adenoma of the thyroid, that is how you basically interpret is what need to be remembered. First one, if you do FNAC of solitary thyroid nodule, it can be negative, follow up. If it is suspicious, surgery. If it is indeterminate, repeat biopsy. Then in such, after repeat biopsy, you may need to monitor if it is more benign likely or if it is more malignant likely, then you need to go for the surgery. Now the next question is, a patient who is euthyroid, both laboratory wise and clinically, who has got a solitary thyroid nodule. When is the scan required as the next step in investigation? If he is hyperthyroid and having a solitary thyroid nodule. That is a different story. You have a euthyroid and a solitary thyroid nodule is there. Then what is the important next investigation? Do you want to do scan there also? Not required. There you need to basically order for a fine needle aspiration is the first investigation that need to be done. If he is hyperthyroid and having a solitary thyroid nodule, then the scan is the next important investigation that need to be done in the diagnostic algorithm is what need to be remembered. Why do we do ultrasound? It is in order to localize the lesion and help to guide the FNAC. That is the reason we do the ultrasound. And based on the radioactive uptake, it is being divided into cold, warm and hot, as all of you know very well. Only 5 to 15% of those which are cold are actually malignant is another common question asked in the exam, is what need to be remembered. Now let us go to the next question. Oxygen toxicity, bronchopulmonary dysplasia has developed, then how will be the pulmonary function test of such a patient? He will have atelectasis, he will have endothelial damage and decreased vital capacity. A typical interstitial type of restrictive pattern is more likely rather than obstructive pattern in bronchopulmonary dysplasia, because the pulmonary toxicity with high oxygen. So in such a patient, pulmonary complaints typically become decreased rather than increased is what need to be basically remembered in bronchopulmonary dysplasia.